On May 29, 1925, a 57-year-old British explorer named Percy Fawcett sat in the middle of the Brazilian jungle at a place he called Dead Horse Camp and wrote his final letter to his wife. He told her he was about to walk into territory no Western man had ever entered, and if he didn't come back, don't send anyone after him.
He had his 22-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's best friend, Raleigh Rimmel, with him. 3 men, walking straight into the Amazon. And after that letter, silence. Complete, absolute silence. The jungle closed behind them like water over a drowning man. Now, I've spent 40 years of my life chasing stories across 6 continents. I've walked through deserts that swallowed entire caravans and climbed mountains where the air itself tries to kill you. But nothing, and I mean nothing, haunts me quite like the Fawcett case, because roughly 100 people died trying to find him afterwards. The Amazon just kept taking and taking. And the strangest part? Decades later, science proved that Fawcett's crazy dream, the lost city everyone laughed at, wasn't crazy at all.
My name is Leonard. I'm 65, and I've been telling stories like this my whole life. This one still gives me chills. Now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. The winter of 1867 arrived in Devon, England, under a sky so heavy with clouds that the sun hadn't shown its face for nearly a week.
The streets of Torquay were slick with cold rain, and the stone houses along the hillside stood gray and silent, as though the entire town had decided to hold its breath until spring.
It was in this damp, quiet corner of the English countryside that Percy Harrison Fawcett was born into a family whose name once carried weight in aristocratic circles, but whose fortune had long since crumbled like old plaster.
His father was a man broken by his own failures, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society on paper, but in practice, a drinker whose reputation had rotted from the inside. His mother, cold and distant, carried herself with the rigid posture of a woman who believed dignity could replace warmth. Young Percy grew up in a house where silence was louder than conversation, where love was something you read about in books, but never quite felt at the dinner table. And maybe that explains everything that came after. Maybe a boy raised in that kind of emptiness grows up searching for something to fill it, something vast enough to swallow the silence whole. Percy was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of the same stone as the Devon cliffs. Even as a young man, there was something intense about his eyes. Pale blue, always scanning, always restless, as if the walls of any room he stood in were already too small for him. He was not a warm person. He did not make friends easily, but he had a quality that drew people in despite themselves, an absolute, unshakable certainty in his own purpose. When Percy Fawcett decided something was true, no force on earth could talk him out of it. This trait would one day make him legendary. It would also destroy him. He was trained at the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, where he learned artillery, surveying, and cartography, skills that would later prove more valuable in the jungle than any weapon. He served in the British Army in Ceylon, which we now call Sri Lanka, and spent years stationed across various outposts of the British Empire. He was a competent soldier, disciplined, physically resilient, but military life bored him. The endless routine, the bureaucratic chains of command, the small politics of garrison towns, none of it satisfied that restless hunger in his chest. Everything changed when he joined the Royal Geographical Society, and in 1906, at the age of 39, the Society sent him to South America to survey the border between Bolivia and Brazil, a region so remote that it existed on European maps as little more than a blank space. A white void surrounded by the words no one had bothered to write. Now I want you to understand what the Amazon was in 1906. This was not a national park with trails and visitor centers. This was the last true wilderness on the planet. An ocean of green that stretched for millions of square miles, filled with creatures and diseases that European science hadn't even named yet. The rivers were highways controlled by nobody. The jungle canopy was so thick that men could walk for days without seeing the sun. And the indigenous tribes living deep inside it had never seen a white face and had no particular reason to welcome one. Fawcett walked straight into it. And unlike most explorers of his era, men who brought small armies and shot first at anything that moved, Fawcett did something extraordinary. He ordered his men never to fire their weapons first. Never. No matter how threatening a situation appeared, no matter how many arrows were pointed at their chests, his team was forbidden from initiating violence. This was not naivety. This was strategy born from a man who had watched the British Empire bleed itself dry, trying to control people by force. Fawcett understood something that most of his contemporaries did not. In the Amazon, you survive by earning trust, not by inspiring fear. Between 1906 and 1914, he launched expedition after expedition into the green darkness. He faced mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever. He encountered anacondas so massive that his men initially refused to believe his measurements. He walked through clouds of parasitic insects that burrowed into human skin to lay their eggs. He starved. He burned with fever. He watched companions collapse and had to leave them behind. And yet every single time, he went back. Because during those years in the jungle, Fawcett began to notice things that didn't fit the accepted story. He found fragments of pottery deep in the forest. Not crude, simple pieces, but intricate, beautifully crafted ceramics that suggested skilled artisans. He listened to indigenous elders speak of a great city that once stood in the forest, a city of stone, older than memory. He studied a document known as Manuscript 512, an 18th century Portuguese colonial record that described a magnificent stone city, abandoned and overgrown, discovered by a group of explorers who stumbled upon it and then could never find it again. The scientific establishment of his time was absolutely certain that the Amazon rainforest could not support complex civilization. The soil was too poor, the environment too hostile, the conditions too brutal for any society to develop beyond small, scattered tribes. This was the accepted truth. It was taught in universities. It was written in textbooks. It was repeated by every expert who had never actually set foot in the jungle. Fawcett looked at his pottery fragments. He listened to the stories of the elders. He read Manuscript 512 again and again. And he decided that every single one of those experts was wrong. He gave the lost city a name. He called it Z, not a romantic name, not a grand title, just a letter, the last letter of the alphabet, as if to say, this is the final mystery, the one at the end of all maps, the one that waits where knowledge runs out. And that single letter would consume the rest of his life. Nearly a century later, in a cramped apartment in New York City, a journalist named David Gran sat surrounded by stacks of old documents and faded photographs. Gran was in his 40s, a thin, bookish man with glasses, and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent far more time under fluorescent library lights than under the sun. He was, by his own honest admission, the last person on Earth suited for jungle exploration. He got lost in subway stations. He was anxious on airplanes. The outdoors, in any serious sense, terrified him. But Gran had stumbled onto the Fawcett story while researching in a dusty archive, and it grabbed him by the throat and would not let go. 3 men walk into the Amazon in 1925 and vanish. Then roughly 100 more people die trying to find them over the following decades. The jungle just keeps swallowing anyone who comes looking. Gran contacted Fawcett's surviving descendants. He traveled to London and sat in the reading rooms of the Royal Geographical Society, turning the pages of Fawcett's original letters, the handwriting still sharp and confident after 100 years. He began to realize that this was not simply a missing persons case. This was a story about obsession, about the line between vision and madness, about what happens when a man believes something so deeply that he's willing to sacrifice everything, including the people he loves, to prove it. And so David Gran, the man who admitted he was completely unsuited for adventure, made the only decision that the story would allow. He booked a flight to Brazil. Percy Fawcett came home from the Western Front in 1918, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 4.
The war had carved deep lines into his face that hadn't been there before, and his eyes, those restless, pale blue eyes that had once burned with the hunger of discovery, now carried something heavier. He had survived the trenches of the Somme and Passchendaele, where men drowned in mud and rats fed on the dead before the stretcher-bearers could reach them. He had breathed chlorine gas that scarred his lungs.
He had watched boys younger than his own son get torn apart by artillery shells, while standing close enough to feel the heat on his skin. The war did not break Percy Fawcett. But it changed the nature of his obsession in a way that no one around him fully understood. Before the war, Z had been a scientific pursuit. Ambitious, yes, perhaps eccentric, but grounded in pottery fragments and colonial manuscripts and the oral histories of indigenous elders. After the war, Z became something else entirely. It became proof. Proof that humanity was capable of building something magnificent, something that endured across centuries, something greater than the industrial machinery of death he had just witnessed in France and Belgium. The trenches had shown Fawcett the very worst of civilization. Z would show him the very best. He needed it to exist the way a drowning man needs air, not as a theory, but as a fact that could justify the entire human experiment. His wife Nina understood this, even if she could not stop it. Nina Fawcett was a small, composed woman with sharp features and dark hair pulled back in a style that never seemed to change across decades of photographs. She was not a fragile person. She had married an explorer knowing exactly what that meant. Years of absence, letters that arrived months late or not at all, the constant low hum of dread that lived beneath every ordinary day. Nina had managed the household alone through Percy's earlier expeditions and through the entire war, raising their children with a quiet, fierce independence that she rarely displayed in public. She believed in her husband's vision of Z with a conviction that matched his own. But she was also the one who sat awake at night when the letters stopped coming, counting the days on a calendar that offered no comfort. Percy spent the years between 1918 and 1925 in a state of furious preparation. He wrote letters to every geographical society, every newspaper editor, every wealthy patron he could find, begging for funding. He was rejected dozens of times. The scientific establishment had grown tired of his claims about lost cities. Former colleagues whispered that the war had unhinged him, that his obsession with Z was a symptom of shell shock rather than genuine scholarship. Fawcett ignored all of it. He drew maps by candlelight, calculated supply lists down to the last ounce of dried beef, and planned a route into the heart of the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, a territory so vast and so hostile that even the Brazilian government had largely given up trying to control it. And then, in 1925, at the age of 57, Percy Fawcett announced his final expedition. The word "final" was his own. He used it deliberately in his correspondence, as though he already knew, somewhere in the architecture of his mind, that this journey would have no return ticket. But what shocked his remaining friends and supporters was not the expedition itself. It was his choice of companions. Fawcett was not taking a team of experienced jungle veterans. He was taking 2 young men with almost no relevant experience. One of them was his own son. Jack Fawcett was 22 years old, tall and athletic, with the same strong jaw as his father, but softer eyes that still carried the openness of youth, the unearned confidence of someone who had never truly been tested. Jack worshipped his father. He had grown up on stories of anacondas and lost cities, on maps spread across the kitchen table, on the smell of jungle mud that still clung to his father's boots months after returning from Brazil. For Jack, this expedition was not just an adventure. It was a chance to finally step into the legend that had defined his entire childhood, to stand beside his father as an equal rather than a listener. The third member of the party was Raleigh Remmel, Jack's closest friend. Raleigh was roughly the same age as Jack, a pleasant-looking young man with a round, open face and an easy smile that made people trust him immediately. He was strong and willing, the kind of person who said yes to things before fully understanding what he was agreeing to. Raleigh had no training in tropical survival, no experience with indigenous contact, no understanding of what the Amazon actually demanded from the human body. He joined the expedition because Jack asked him to, and because the idea of exploring uncharted jungle sounded like the greatest adventure a young Englishman could imagine. He had no way of knowing that his loyalty to his best friend would cost him everything. The three men departed from Cuiabá, the capital of Mato Grosso, in April of 1925. They traveled with pack animals and a small group of Brazilian helpers who would accompany them only to the edge of the known territory before turning back. Beyond that point, it would be just the three of them, a 57-year-old man with scarred lungs, his 22-year-old son, and his son's inexperienced best friend, walking into a jungle that had swallowed every expedition that had ever tried to penetrate it. On May 29, 1925, Fawcett sat down at a place he called Dead Horse Camp, named for the pack animal that had collapsed and died of exhaustion at this exact spot during one of his earlier expeditions, and wrote his last letter to Nina. The camp was little more than a patch of cleared ground, surrounded by a wall of green so dense it seemed solid. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of insects was constant, a living static that never paused, not even at night. Fawcett's handwriting in this final letter was steady and deliberate. He told Nina that they were about to cross into territory where no Western person had ever walked. He told her that the journey ahead would take them beyond all communication. And then he wrote a sentence that would haunt his family and the world for the next century. If they did not return, she must not send rescue parties, because it would only mean more death. There was no panic in the letter, no doubt, no farewell disguised as reassurance. Just the calm, terrifying certainty of a man who had weighed the odds and accepted them completely. He sealed the letter. He gave it to a Brazilian courier who would carry it back to civilization. And then Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and young Raleigh Rimmel turned their backs on the last outpost of the known world and walked into the jungle. After that, nothing. No letters, no sightings, no traces. The forest closed behind them the way deep water closes over a sinking stone, leaving no ripple, no mark, no memory on its surface. Three men simply ceased to exist. Meanwhile, in a reading room at the Royal Geographical Society in London, nearly a century later, David Gran held Fawcett's original letters in his hands. The paper had yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting remained sharp and confident, the penmanship of a man who never questioned his own direction. Gran turned the pages carefully, feeling the strange intimacy of holding words that were written in a jungle camp thousands of miles away by a man who would never write again. Through Fawcett's descendants, Gran gained access to documents the family had never made public. Among them was the personal diary of Nina Fawcett. Reading it was, by Gran's own account, one of the most painful experiences of his research. Nina had never accepted that Percy and Jack were dead. For decades after their disappearance, she wrote letters to psychics and mediums, begging for any scrap of contact with her husband and son. She kept Percy's expedition bag packed and ready by the front door of their home, as though he might walk through it at any moment, sunburned and smiling, with stories of Z on his lips. She died in 1954, still waiting. It was Nina's story, not Percy's, that made Gran finally understand what he was dealing with. This was not just a mystery about a missing explorer. This was a story about the people left behind, about the terrible gravity of obsession, about what happens to the ones who stay when someone they love walks into the unknown and never comes back. Gran closed the diary. He sat in the silence of the reading room for a long time, and he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he was going to Brazil.
The news of Fawcett's disappearance did not reach the outside world all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a wall. Months passed after the last letter from Dead Horse Camp before anyone was willing to say the words out loud.
Nina Fawcett refused to say them at all. But by late 1926, the silence had become too heavy to ignore, and the Royal Geographical Society quietly acknowledged what the jungle had already decided. Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel were gone.
Not confirmed dead, just gone. And that distinction, the absence of a body, the absence of proof, the absence of anything final, was precisely what made the Fawcett case so dangerous. Because a mystery without an ending is a door that never closes, and people cannot resist walking through open doors.
The first serious rescue expedition launched in 1927, organized by George Miller Dyott, a British explorer and filmmaker who saw in the Fawcett mystery both a genuine humanitarian mission and an opportunity for fame. Dyott was a tall, broad-chested man in his mid-40s with a thick mustache and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. He had experience in South America and believed, with the kind of certainty that the Amazon punishes most severely, that he could succeed where Fawcett had failed. He assembled a well-funded team, brought modern radio equipment, and marched into the Mato Grosso with cameras rolling, intending to document either a rescue or a revelation. What he found instead was the same green wall that had swallowed Fawcett. Dyott's expedition reached the territory of the Kalapalo people, an indigenous group living along the upper Xingu River. Through broken communication and gestures, the Kalapalo told Dyott that they had indeed seen an old white man and two younger companions passing through their land years earlier. According to their account, the three strangers had continued east into dangerous territory despite warnings, and smoke had been seen rising from the jungle for several days afterward. The implication was clear, but unverifiable. The Fawcett party may have been killed by a hostile neighboring tribe. Dyott returned to civilization with this second-hand testimony, but no physical evidence whatsoever. No bones, no equipment, no graves. The jungle had offered a whisper and nothing more. But the whisper was enough to keep the door open. And through that door, over the following decades, walked a procession of men who would pay increasingly terrible prices for their curiosity. In 1928, a small party of American explorers entered the Mato Grosso, claiming to have received secret coordinates from a psychic who had communicated with Fawcett's spirit. They were never seen again. In the early 1930s, a Swiss trapper named Stefan Ratten emerged from the jungle claiming he had encountered an elderly white man being held captive by indigenous people, a man who whispered that he was a British colonel and begged for help. Ratten's story made international headlines, but when he attempted to lead a rescue party back to the location, the jungle defeated them within weeks, and the prisoner, if he had ever existed, was never found. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the theories multiplied like bacteria in warm water. Some believed Fawcett had been killed by jaguars. Others insisted he had contracted a disease that left him too weak to travel, and had simply laid down in the forest and died. A particularly persistent rumor claimed that Fawcett had never intended to return at all, that his true goal was not to find Z, but to establish a mystical commune deep in the jungle, inspired by the theosophical and occult beliefs he had quietly pursued for years. This theory gained traction, partly because Fawcett had indeed been a member of several esoteric societies, and had expressed interest in spiritualism, reincarnation, and the idea that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge that modern science had lost. For those who believed this version, Fawcett was not a victim of the Amazon. He was a willing convert, a man who had chosen the jungle over civilization and had no desire to be found. Objects allegedly belonging to Fawcett surfaced periodically, each one generating a brief explosion of hope, followed by the quiet disappointment of failed verification. A compass said to be his appeared in a Brazilian market town. A signet ring was produced by a trader who claimed he had received it from an indigenous chief. A set of human bones was presented by a Kalapalo elder in 1951, accompanied by the claim that these were the remains of the old Englishman. The bones were sent to London for analysis. The Royal Anthropological Institute examined them and concluded that they did not belong to Fawcett. The measurements of the skull were wrong. The teeth did not match his dental records. Another dead end. Another door that opened onto nothing but more jungle. The most tragic chapters of the search, however, were written not by the theories, but by the people who acted on them. In 1952, a young Brazilian journalist named Edmar Morel, a compact, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and an almost reckless determination to make his name, organized an expedition into the Xingu region. He brought a small team and limited supplies, believing that speed and local knowledge would succeed where larger expeditions had failed. His party was captured by an indigenous group and held for months before being released in a state of severe malnutrition. Morel survived, but his health never fully recovered. In 1955, yet another expedition vanished entirely. The details were sparse. A group of adventurers had entered the forest near the last known coordinates of the Fawcett party, and the forest had simply absorbed them the way it absorbed everything. No trace was ever found. By some estimates, across the decades following Fawcett's disappearance, as many as 100 people died or vanished in expeditions that were directly or indirectly inspired by his story. The Amazon had turned the Fawcett mystery into a kind of gravitational field. The closer you got to it, the harder it became to pull away, and the more likely it was to consume you entirely. Each failed expedition added another layer to the legend, and each layer made the next attempt more inevitable. This was the paradox at the heart of the Fawcett case. Every death was supposed to serve as a warning, but instead it functioned as an invitation. Because if the jungle was willing to kill so many people to protect its secret, then the secret must be worth finding. The danger was not a deterrent, it was proof of value. David Gran understood this paradox intellectually. He had spent months in archives reading about every failed expedition, every dead journalist, every vanished adventurer. He had compiled a list of names, people who had gone looking for Fawcett and had never returned, and the length of that list should have been enough to make any rational person close the file and walk away. Gran was a rational person. He was also a man sitting in a comfortable apartment in New York, with no survival training, no experience in tropical environments, no physical conditioning for jungle travel, and a general disposition toward anxiety that made even routine air travel an ordeal. And yet he could feel it, the same invisible pull that had drawn Deat, Morel, and all the others. It was not courage. Gran would have been the first to say it was not courage. It was something closer to compulsion, the feeling that a story had chosen him rather than the other way around, and that refusing to follow it would be a kind of cowardice, worse than the physical danger of going. He recognized, with the uncomfortable clarity of a man studying his own reflection, that he was experiencing in miniature the exact same obsession he was researching. The Fawcett mystery did not merely attract people, it infected them. And Gran, for all his self-awareness, was not immune. He booked his flight to Mato Grosso on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at his desk with his hands trembling slightly on the keyboard. He told himself it was journalism. He told himself it was research. But somewhere beneath those reasonable explanations, in the part of his mind where rational thought gave way to something older and less controllable, he knew the truth. The jungle was calling. And like every person who had heard that call before him, he was answering.
The Amazon rainforest is not a place. It is a condition. It is what happens when nature decides to grow without restraint, without mercy, and without the slightest consideration for anything that walks on two legs.
Covering more than 2 million square miles, an area larger than the entire European continent, it is the largest tropical forest on the planet, and it operates by rules that no amount of human preparation can fully account for. Fawcett's expedition journals from his earlier trips between 1906 and 1914 read like dispatches from another world. He described a canopy so thick and so continuous that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight, a dim, green-filtered half-light, where the sun was a rumor rather than a fact. The air beneath that canopy was not simply humid, It was saturated, heavy with moisture that clung to the skin like a warm, wet cloth and never evaporated. Every breath felt like drinking. Sweat did not cool the body because the air was already as wet as the skin, and so the heat accumulated inside a person hour by hour, draining energy even while standing perfectly still. Men who had served in the deserts of North Africa and considered themselves hardened by heat collapsed within days of entering the Amazon, not from exertion, but from the simple, relentless act of existing in an atmosphere that seemed designed to dissolve the human body from the outside in. The insects were not a nuisance. They were an assault. Fawcett wrote of mosquitoes arriving in clouds so dense that breathing through the nose became impossible. Men wrapped cloth around their faces and inhaled through the fabric, which filtered out the larger bodies but could not stop the smaller ones. The bites accumulated until the skin became a continuous landscape of swollen red welts, and each welt, in the jungle's permanent moisture, became a potential infection site. But mosquitoes were only the beginning. Fawcett documented bot flies, fat, buzzing creatures that laid their eggs on other insects, which then transferred the larvae onto human skin. The larvae burrowed beneath the surface and grew there, feeding on living tissue, creating painful lumps that had to be suffocated with tobacco paste or cut out with a knife. He described ticks that embedded themselves so deeply that pulling them out left the head beneath the skin, guaranteeing infection. He wrote about tiny parasitic worms in the river water that could enter the human body through any opening and destroy internal organs over a period of weeks, often without the victim realizing anything was wrong until it was far too late. The rivers themselves, the only highways through the forest, were treacherous in ways that went far beyond parasites. Anacondas, the largest snakes on Earth, hunted along the waterways. Fawcett claimed to have encountered one that measured over 60 feet in length, a figure that scientists back in London dismissed as exaggeration, but that fellow explorers who had seen the deep jungle specimens did not find implausible. Piranhas schooled in the slower tributaries, capable of reducing an animal to bone in minutes when blood entered the water. Caimans, the South American relatives of crocodiles, lay motionless along the banks, indistinguishable from logs until they moved. Electric eels delivered shocks powerful enough to stun a horse. And beneath the murky surface, stingrays buried in the mud could drive a barbed spine through a leather boot and into the foot of anyone unlucky enough to step on them. The indigenous tribes presented a different kind of danger, though Fawcett always insisted it was one that could be managed through respect rather than force. On his earlier expeditions, he had encountered groups who had never seen outsiders and whose first instinct was defensive hostility. Arrows launched from the tree line without warning, poison-tipped darts fired from blowguns that made no sound. Fawcett's response was always the same. He ordered his men to put down their weapons, stand in the open, and offer gifts. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the arrows kept coming and the expedition had to retreat. But Fawcett never authorized a single shot fired in aggression, and this policy, remarkable for its era, earned him a reputation among certain tribes as a different kind of white man, one who could be tolerated if not entirely trusted. During the final expedition of 1925, the jungle showed no such tolerance. From the moment Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel left their last point of contact with the outside world, the conditions deteriorated rapidly. The rainy season had turned the trails into rivers of knee-deep mud that sucked at every step and doubled the energy required to cover even a single mile. Their pack animals, mules brought from Cuiaba, began dying within the first weeks. The animals sank into the mud, refused to move, and had to be abandoned with whatever supplies they carried. Food became scarce. The dried rations they had calculated so carefully began to run out faster than planned because the physical demands of moving through waterlogged terrain burned calories at a rate Fawcett had not anticipated. Raleigh Rimmel was the first to falter. The young man who had joined this expedition out of loyalty to his best friend, who had said yes before fully understanding what the Amazon would ask of him, developed a severe infection in his foot. The exact cause was never recorded, but in the jungle, the cause hardly mattered. A blister, a thorn puncture, an insect bite. Any break in the skin became a doorway for bacteria that thrived in the warm, wet environment. Raleigh's foot swelled until he could barely force it into his boot. Each step sent pain shooting up through his leg, and the infection showed no sign of responding to the limited medical supplies they carried. He began to slow. He began to fall behind. And Fawcett, according to the final letters, did not stop. This was the cruelty at the center of Fawcett's greatness. The same iron determination that had carried him through decades of jungle exploration, that had earned him the admiration of the Royal Geographical Society, that had kept him alive in situations that killed younger and stronger men. That same quality now manifested as an inability to turn back even when the evidence demanded it. At 57, with damaged lungs from the war, Fawcett marched forward while a 22-year-old boy limped behind him, and the jungle closed in from every side. He had bet everything on Zaid, his reputation, his family, his son's life. And a man who has bet everything cannot fold, because folding means admitting that the bet itself was madness. Nearly a century later, David Gran stood in that same jungle and felt what Fawcett must have felt, though in a diluted, modern version that was nevertheless overwhelming. Gran had hired a local guide, a lean and quiet Brazilian man named Paulo, who moved through the forest with the effortless economy of someone born to it. Paulo was middle-aged, dark-skinned, with calloused hands, and an expression of patient amusement that suggested he found the journalist's discomfort both predictable and slightly entertaining. He spoke little but communicated volumes through gestures. A raised hand meant stop, a pointed finger meant look, a slow shake of the head meant do not touch that under any circumstances. They traveled by boat up a tributary of the Xingu River, then continued on foot into the forest. The rain was constant. Not the dramatic, theatrical rain of storms, but a steady, gray, suffocating drizzle that soaked everything and stopped nothing. Within hours, Gran's clothes were heavy with water, his boots squelched with every step, and insects had found every exposed inch of skin. He lost all sense of direction almost immediately. Under the canopy, there was no sun to navigate by, no landmarks to recognize, no horizon to orient against. There was only green, above, below, and on every side, and the narrow path that Paulo cut with a machete, which the jungle began reclaiming the moment they passed. Gran later wrote that the experience fundamentally changed his understanding of the Fawcett case. Standing in that forest, feeling the weight of the air and the indifference of the ecosystem surrounding him, he realized that disappearing in the Amazon was not a mystery. It was the default outcome. The jungle did not need a conspiracy or a catastrophe to erase a human being. It only needed time and its own ordinary processes: infection, dehydration, exhaustion, fever. The real question, Gran understood now, was not how Fawcett had vanished. It was how he had survived long enough to vanish so deep.
For nearly a century after Percy Fawcett walked into the jungle and never came back, the scientific establishment treated his dream with a kind of polite contempt.
The consensus was overwhelming and, as far as the academic world was concerned, settled beyond debate. The Amazon rainforest was a biological desert disguised as a garden.
Yes, it teemed with life, more species per square mile than anywhere else on Earth, but that very richness was considered evidence of its hostility to human civilization. The soil was too thin, too acidic, too quickly exhausted by cultivation. The rainfall leached nutrients from the ground faster than any farming method could replace them.
The climate bred disease at a rate that no pre-modern society could have withstood for long. The Amazon, according to this orthodoxy, could support scattered bands of hunter-gatherers numbering in the dozens or low hundreds, but never the kind of large, organized, permanent settlements that constituted true civilization. The textbooks were clear. The professors were certain. And Percy Fawcett, with his lost city of Z, was filed away as a cautionary tale about what happens when personal obsession overwhelms scientific judgment. His reputation deteriorated steadily through the decades. In the 1930s and 1940s, he was still remembered as a brave, if eccentric, explorer. By the 1960s, the tone had shifted. Academic papers referenced him as an example of colonial romanticism, a man who projected European fantasies of grandeur onto a landscape that had never produced anything resembling a city. By the 1980s, the judgment had become harsher still. Fawcett was the man who had dragged his own son and his son's best friend into the jungle to die for a delusion. The pottery fragments he had collected were dismissed as trade goods that had traveled far from their point of origin. The indigenous oral histories he had cited were discounted as myth rather than evidence. Manuscript 512, the Portuguese colonial document that had fueled his conviction, was classified as either a forgery or the fevered imagination of lost colonists who had hallucinated a stone city in the tropical heat. Everything Fawcett had believed was dismantled piece by piece by a scientific community that was absolutely sure it knew what the Amazon was and what it could never have been. And then the science changed. Not with a dramatic announcement or a single revolutionary discovery, but slowly, quietly, in the way that the most important corrections often happen. One patient researcher at a time, working far from the spotlight, accumulating evidence that the old certainties could not absorb. David Gran arrived at this turning point almost by accident. He had traveled into the Mato Grosso expecting to find the end of the Fawcett story, a final confirmation of how and where the explorer had died. What he found instead was the beginning of a completely different narrative. His guide, Paulo, who had led him through the jungle in the previous weeks, arranged passage to the upper Xingu region, where a small community of the Quikoro people maintained a settlement that had existed in various forms for generations. It was here, in a clearing surrounded by forest so dense it felt like a wall, that Gran met the man who would rewrite everything he thought he knew. Michael Heckenberger was an American archaeologist in his late 40s, a tall, sun-darkened man with the lean build of someone who had spent more of his adult life outdoors than inside any building. His hair was streaked with gray and perpetually unkempt, and his hands were rough and scarred from years of digging in tropical soil. He had the calm, measured manner of a person who had long ago stopped caring about academic politics and was focused entirely on what the ground beneath his feet was telling him. Heckenberger had been living among the Quikoro, on and off, for more than a decade, learning their language, earning their trust, and conducting meticulous excavations in the surrounding forest. He was not a man given to dramatic claims. He let the evidence speak, and he waited until the evidence was overwhelming before he opened his mouth. When Gran explained his research into Fawcett, Heckenberger listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. And then he said something that Gran would later describe as the single most important sentence of his entire investigation. He said that Fawcett was not wrong. He was closer to the truth than anyone realized. Heckenberger led Gran into the forest on foot. They walked for less than an hour before the archaeologist stopped, knelt down, and brushed away a layer of leaf litter and topsoil. Beneath it, the earth was black, a deep, rich, unmistakable black that contrasted sharply with the pale, nutrient-poor soil that characterized most of the Amazon basin. This was terra preta, Heckenberger explained, anthropogenic dark earth, soil that had been deliberately created by human beings through centuries of composting, charcoal burning, and waste management. It was not natural, it was engineered. And it was everywhere in this region, stretching across areas far too large to have been produced by a small band of nomadic hunters. But the soil was only the beginning. Over the following days, Heckenberger showed Gran what years of careful excavation and satellite imaging had revealed beneath the canopy. There were roads, not animal trails, not natural clearings, but deliberately constructed roads, wide and straight, connecting settlement sites across distances of many miles. There were defensive ditches, deep and precisely dug, surrounding the perimeters of what had once been large communities. There were the remnants of bridges that had spanned waterways, and the outlines of central plazas, open public spaces arranged with a geometric regularity that implied not just planning but sophisticated urban design. The settlements were not small. Heckenberger's data suggested that some of these communities had housed thousands of people, organized into networks that traded, communicated, and coordinated construction projects across a region the size of a European country. The dates were critical. Radiocarbon analysis placed the peak of these settlements between approximately 1200 and 1600 AD, centuries before Fawcett was born, but well within the time frame he had proposed for his lost civilization. The decline had come swiftly and catastrophically. When European explorers and colonists arrived in South America in the 16th century, they brought with them diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, against which the indigenous population had no immunity. The epidemics swept through the Amazon basin like fire through dry grass, killing an estimated 90% of the native population within a few generations. The great settlements were abandoned. The roads fell silent. The forest, patient and relentless, moved back in and covered everything. Within a few centuries, the jungle had erased all visible trace of civilizations that had thrived for hundreds of years. By the time Western scientists arrived to study the Amazon, there was nothing left to see, and so they concluded there had never been anything there at all. Gran stood in the forest, listening to Heckenberger, and felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of the entire story. Fawcett had been right about the fundamental question. The Amazon had supported complex, populous civilizations. The green hell that scientists had declared incapable of nurturing human society had in fact been home to some of the most sophisticated settlements in the pre-Columbian Americas. Fawcett's error was one of form, not substance. He had imagined a city of stone, columns and arches and carved facades, the kind of monumental architecture that Europeans recognized as civilization. What had actually existed was something different, and, in its own way, more remarkable. Cities built from organic materials, wood, earth, and living plants, that left no permanent scar on the landscape and returned to the forest when their builders were gone. It was a civilization designed in harmony with its environment rather than in opposition to it, and that very harmony was what had made it invisible to Western eyes. The irony was almost unbearable. Fawcett had died searching for something that was, in essence, directly beneath his feet. The city of Z was not a single hidden location waiting to be discovered behind one more ridge or across one more river. It was an entire network of communities spread across the very territory he had been walking through. He had been looking for stone walls in a world built from wood and earth, and the jungle, which had preserved these secrets for centuries, had taken him before he could understand what he was standing on.
David Gran left the Xingu region on a small propeller plane that rattled so violently during takeoff that he gripped the edges of his seat until his knuckles turned white.
Below him, the Amazon stretched to every horizon, an unbroken expanse of green so vast and so uniform that it looked less like a forest and more like an ocean, a living sea with no shore in sight. Somewhere down there, beneath that canopy, lay the bones of Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and young Raleigh Rimmel. Somewhere down there, the roads and plazas and ditches of a civilization that Western science had refused to believe in were slowly being mapped by researchers who would spend their entire careers uncovering what the jungle had buried. And somewhere down there, in a place that no satellite image or archaeological survey would ever pinpoint, was the exact spot where three men had taken their last steps, the precise coordinates where ambition had crossed the line into something else, something that still had no adequate name. Gran flew to Cuiabá, then to Sao Paulo, then to New York. Each airport was louder and more crowded than the last, each terminal more aggressively lit, each crowd more indifferent to the fact that a journalist was returning from a place where the rules of civilized life did not apply. He arrived back at his apartment in Manhattan on a gray afternoon, dropped his bag on the floor, and sat at his desk for a long time without moving. The apartment was quiet. The walls were lined with books and files. On his desk, stacked in neat piles, were the photocopies of Fawcett's letters, the notes from his interviews with Heckenberger, the maps he had marked with red circles during months of research. All of it was here. Everything he had gathered. And none of it answered the one question that mattered most. What exactly happened to Percy Fawcett? The honest answer. The answer that Gran would eventually write, with the reluctant integrity of a journalist who refuses to invent a conclusion he cannot prove, was that nobody knows. Not with certainty. Not with evidence. The jungle kept its secret, and there is no reason to believe it will ever give it up. The Kalapalo elders had told their version, that the 3 white men had passed through their territory and continued east, and that smoke had been seen for days afterward, possibly indicating that a neighboring tribe had killed them. Other indigenous groups offered different accounts. Some said the old white man had lived among a tribe for years, before dying of illness. Some said all 3 had been killed on the first night after leaving Kalapalo territory. Some said nothing at all, watching the outsiders who came asking questions with the patient wariness of people who had learned over centuries that white men's curiosity rarely brought anything good. No bones were ever conclusively identified as belonging to Fawcett, Jack, or Rimmel. The set of remains presented in 1951 had been rejected after analysis in London. Other fragments surfaced over the years, a jawbone here, a femur there, but none survived the scrutiny of forensic examination. The jungle, with its acidic soil, its termites, its constant cycle of growth and decay, is extraordinarily efficient at erasing the physical evidence of death. A human body left on the forest floor can be reduced to nothing within months. Bones dissolve, fabric rots, metal rusts to powder. The Amazon does not preserve its dead. It recycles them, folding them back into the soil that feeds the roots that feed the trees that grow the canopy that hides everything from view. Fawcett did not simply die in the jungle. He was absorbed by it, returned to the earth as completely as the civilizations he had spent his life searching for. And this, Gran realized, was the deepest irony of the entire story. Fawcett had gone looking for a lost city, a place that had been swallowed by the forest and erased from human memory. And in the end, the forest did the same thing to him. He became his own lost city, a man who vanished so completely that he existed only in the stories people told about him, stories that grew more elaborate and more mythologized with each passing decade, until the real Percy Fawcett, the complicated, brilliant, obsessive, selfish, courageous, reckless man who had actually lived, was buried under layers of legend as thick as the jungle canopy itself. The cost of Fawcett's obsession was not abstract. It was measured in specific human lives, each one with a name and a face. Jack Fawcett was 22 years old, a young man with his father's jaw and softer eyes, who worshipped his father and followed him into the green darkness without hesitation. He never had a career. He never married. He never grew old. Whatever potential his life contained was surrendered to a dream that was not his own. And the fact that the dream turned out to be partially correct does not reduce the waste of his death by a single measure. Raleigh Rimmel was even younger in spirit, if not in years, a boy who joined an expedition because his best friend asked him to, whose loyalty was rewarded with suffering and silence, and an unmarked grave in a forest he had never wanted to enter. And Nina Fawcett, who was not in the jungle at all, but who paid perhaps the heaviest price of anyone, spent the remaining 29 years of her life suspended in a state of permanent uncertainty. She never remarried. She never accepted that Percy and Jack were dead. She kept writing letters to mediums and mystics, kept Percy's expedition bag packed by the door, kept a candle of hope burning in a window that no one would ever walk through again. She died in 1954, at the age of 84, still waiting. A woman whose entire adult life had been shaped by the gravitational pull of a man who chose the jungle over everything else, including her. Fawcett was both hero and destroyer. He was the man who looked at the Amazon and saw what no Western scientist of his era was willing to see. That this forest had nurtured complex, thriving civilizations, that the indigenous people who lived there were the inheritors of a profound and sophisticated history, that the arrogance of European assumptions had blinded an entire scientific establishment to the truth beneath its feet. He was right about the most important question of his career and history, through the slow, patient work of researchers like Heckenberger, eventually proved him so. But he was also the man who could not stop, who could not weigh the evidence, assess the risk, and decide that his son's life was worth more than his theory, who could not look at Raleigh Rimmel's infected foot and say the words that any reasonable leader would have said, "We are turning back." The same quality that made Fawcett capable of seeing what others could not, his absolute, uncompromising conviction, was the quality that made him incapable of the compromise that survival required. His vision and his destruction grew from the same root. Gran sat in his New York apartment and thought about this for a long time. He thought about the line between ambition and madness, and how thin that line becomes when a person believes they are close to something extraordinary. He thought about how every great discovery in human history was made by someone who refused to listen to the people telling them to stop, and how the graveyards are full of people who also refused to listen, and were simply wrong. The difference between a visionary and a fool is often visible only in retrospect, and sometimes not even then. He thought about his own journey. He had felt the pull of the Fawcett mystery himself, the irrational, almost physical compulsion to go deeper, to find one more clue, to answer one more question. He had recognized it while standing in the jungle, sweating through his clothes, lost and exhausted, and he had understood in that moment that obsession does not announce itself as obsession. It disguises itself as passion, as duty, as the simple inability to leave a story unfinished. Gran had been lucky. He had a return ticket. Fawcett did not because he couldn't afford one, but because he never intended to use it. The Amazon rainforest remains, as it has always been, indifferent to human ambition. It does not care about lost cities or archaeological revolutions or the reputations of dead explorers. It grows, it consumes, it recycles, and it keeps its secrets with the patience of something that has been here for millions of years and will be here for millions more, long after the last person who remembers the name Percy Fawcett has turned to dust. The jungle's silence is not emptiness. It is simply the sound of a world that has no obligation to explain itself. A world that waits in its own green darkness for anyone patient enough to listen and ruthless enough to survive the listening. And somewhere beneath that endless canopy, in a place no map will ever mark, 3 men sleep in the earth they gave their lives to understand: the father, the son, and the friend. Their story unfinished, their bones returned to the soil of a civilization they proved existed, but never lived to see acknowledged. The forest grew over them the way it grew over everything. And the silence, once again, became complete. You know, after telling this story, I always find myself sitting quietly for a moment. Because the truth Percy Fawcett teaches us is not really about jungles or lost cities. It is about something much closer to home. Every single one of us carries a dream. Maybe it is building a business. Maybe it is raising your children well. Maybe it is simply becoming the person you always knew you could be. And that dream, when it burns bright enough, can push you to do extraordinary things. It can make you brave. It can make you resilient. It can make you see possibilities that everyone else says are impossible. But Fawcett also reminds us that the same fire that lights the way can burn down everything around you if you are not careful. He was right about the lost city. Science proved it. But being right cost him his son, his family, and his life. And no discovery, no matter how great, is worth that price.
So the lesson I carry with me is simple. Chase your dreams, but never forget to look beside you. The people walking with you on this journey, your family, your friends, the ones who believe in you even when the world does not, they are the real treasure. No lost city is worth more than the people who love you. Life is short, my friends. The jungle does not wait.
So hold your loved ones close. Work hard, stay humble, and never forget that sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when to keep going and when to turn back home.
I want to thank each and every one of you for staying with me through this story. If it touched your heart, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so we can continue these journeys together. May God bless you and your families. May He watch over you wherever you are in this world, and may He give you the courage to follow your dreams and the wisdom to protect the ones you love while doing it. If you feel that in your heart, type Amen in the comments. I read every single one. This is Leonard.
Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next story.